We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the fallout from the FOIA POP leak continues to grow, unfortunately. We are hearing from victims who have been notified by the Department of Internal Services, and we are learning that a class action suit against the province is possible. But I want to speak to a more specific area of this leak, and that is how it actually happened. The Department of Internal Services placed the private personal information of Nova Scotians on a public website without the security of a password or an encryption. And we know that this private and personal information was not identified by a professional hacker. So can the Premier tell us if it is the responsibility of the Department of Internal Services to protect the private personal information it has collected?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Anytime personal information is given to whether it's government or any organization, Mr. Speaker, it's up to those organizations to protect it. In this case, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at how this happened, how this information was downloaded through a site, Mr. Speaker. It's our understanding that codes had to be changed and then the information was downloaded thereafter. Mr. Speaker, we have turned the IP address over. The police are doing their investigation, Mr. Speaker. We've taken down the site, and before that site goes up, we'll make sure, Mr. Speaker, that it is secure.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
On January 16, 2017, the Department of Internal Services issued a press release about the FOIA POP portal that said, personal or confidential business information will not be released online. On this commitment, the department failed, as the information was released. On September 28th, in a press release about the FOIA POP portal, the minister was quoted as saying, "We will continue to strengthen our access and privacy practices to improve transparency and accountability." The department failed to do this, and there has been no accountability. The department said both of these things while private personal information was easily available online. In this government, is the minister considered to be responsible for the actions, inaction, omission of the department and its officials?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I can't tell you how proud of the way I am the Minister has handled this file before us, Mr. Speaker. Immediately on knowing, identifying, Mr. Speaker, that there's a potential breach of this portal, we brought it down. Her staff went through the appropriate channels, Mr. Speaker. We called in the right partners, Mr. Speaker. They have now, it's in their hands. Our job now is to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that before that portal goes up, that all of the information on that, Mr. Speaker, will be safe.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I would like to read a quote, Mr. Speaker. Internal Service should continue to implement robust cybersecurity and privacy programs that protect Nova Scotians. That quote actually came from the mandate letter addressed to the minister, dated September 2017 and signed by this Premier. Protect Nova Scotians. That was the mandate this Premier gave to his minister. It is up to him, Mr. Speaker, to either hold his minister's account or signal that his mandates are optional. So I will ask the Premier, does he believe the minister failed to meet his mandate to meet his mandate that he gave? Or did he decide that his mandates are optional?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the honourable member of all Nova Scotians that this minister not only met my mandate, Mr. Speaker, she's met the mandate and the expectations of Nova Scotians, quite frankly. What she did, Mr. Speaker, immediately upon seeing there was an issue, notified there was an issue, Mr. Speaker, that site came down, there was an assessment, the appropriate information was turned over to the appropriate officials, Mr. Speaker. It is now in their hands to continue that process. Our job now is to ensure that before that site goes up, Mr. Speaker, it is protected.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, last week, physician recruiters from across the country were present for the National Rural and Remote Medicine Program in St. John's to make recruiting pitches to the 600 medical students, residents and family doctors in attendance at the program. Every province and territory was represented there with only one exception, Nova Scotia. And when asked to comment about this, the Nova Scotia Health Authority said the meeting wasn't worth the money. Mr. Speaker, this brings into question, how can it but bring into question, the fundamental competence of the health authorities physician recruitment efforts. So I'd like to ask the Premier, how can people put faith in his government's claims to be on top of the doctor shortage file when Nova Scotia is the only province not to show up at a major recruiting event?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for his thoughtful question, Mr. Speaker. The matter of fact is, I am as upset as he is about this very issue. I contacted the Minister of Finance or Minister of Health to ensure he reaches out to the Health Authority because it's unacceptable that this province is the only Canadian province not at this time.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Then this morning we learned that the Department of Health is being taken to court by the Office of the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman seeking information related to a complaint about the forcible confinement and neglect of an intellectually disabled person, and the Department of Health is refusing to cooperate with the investigation of the Ombudsman's office, citing privacy concerns and their view that the Ombudsman doesn't have jurisdiction in the matter. So, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, when his government's Department of Health refuses to cooperate even with the Ombudsman, can the Premier understand why an awful lot of people would then look at the government and the Department of Health and wonder what in the world is going on here?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know the details of the specific case the honourable member is referring to. I know there are often times when there are different third parties looking out for information of individuals. Mr. Speaker, that is not released without the authorization of that individual or those families, Mr. Speaker, and they can release it to them. But I want to go back to his first question, Mr. Speaker, about the fact it is unacceptable. It is unacceptable that the province of Nova Scotia is the only province in Canada that doesn't show up when it comes to recruiting physicians, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
The government's ongoing handling of health care continues to be baffling and troubling to an awful lot of people. When we look for listening, we get dictation. When we look for openness, we get closed doors. We look for investment, we get penny pinching. So here's the question. What does the Premier say to the hundreds of seniors who are waiting for long-term placement and the thousands of people whose ERs in their communities are closed and the 100,000 people who don't have a family doctor, all of whom are registering a deep disappointment in his government's work on the healthcare file?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I want to thank the honourable member for his thoughtful question, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, we've continued to eliminate the home care list across our province. Many seniors are telling us, Mr. Speaker, they want to be able to remain at home as long as possible. We continue to make those investments. Working with our partners around long-term care, we've been able to, Mr. Speaker, cut that wait list in half, Mr. Speaker, in the first
Order,
mandate.
please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Right over again, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell the honourable member, thank him for his very thoughtful question, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is we continue to invest in home care in every one of our budgets where seniors tell us they want to receive that investment.
Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for his question, Mr. Speaker, and I want to go back and tell him every budget we've invested in home care, Mr. Speaker, to continue to make sure people receive the care they wanted. We've reduced the long-term care wait list by half, Mr. Speaker, continuing to make for caregivers and, Mr. Speaker, investing in family caregivers who are looking after loved ones at home. We know there's more work to do, and we're thankful for those Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, who are working with us to find solutions for the challenges facing this province.
Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, I was going to stand up and I was going to say that I was shocked to learn that the Nova Scotia Health Authority failed to send any recruiters to the Rural Medicine Conference in St. John's, which was attended by 600 medical students, residents and family doctors, Mr. Speaker. But I'm not shocked. I'm saddened, I'm frustrated, but I'm not shocked. I'm not shocked because it's the same practice as the Nova Scotia Health Authority to make decisions that reinforce their own self-importance. Mr. Speaker, it's so simple. We need doctors here. There are doctors over there in meetings who want to go other places. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health. What excuse can the Minister possibly offer for why Nova Scotia wasn't represented at that conference?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member would know, we agree that that conference and the NSHA should be looking at every opportunity to recruit physicians and primary care providers to the province of Nova Scotia, and we look forward to work with them to do so.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we need doctors in Nova Scotia. We need specialists. We need family docs. We need locums. We need to go where the doctors are, and we need to go where our competitors are. And make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, we are in a competition with every province in Canada and every jurisdiction around the world. The Yukon even sent recruiters to this, and Nova Scotia didn't. I mean, it's beyond comprehension. Mr. Speaker, there's even a boat that runs from our province to Newfoundland. Now, I'm sure if my colleague from Northside Westmount would be happy to tell the minister and the members of the NSHL how to get there, and if he doesn't, I'd be happy to tell them where to go. Mr. Speaker, my question for the minister is simple. Why is it the minister really is the minister really prepared to tell Nova Scotians that St. John's is too far and that $8,000 is too much for the province to invest in trying to get doctors? Next year the conference is here. He can put it out on the sidewalk. It won't cost him anything.
Mr. Speaker, our commitment to recruitment maintains. That's why we've expanded, working with our Department of Immigration, the opportunity to recruit not just nationally but internationally. Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
So as we said, Mr. Speaker, we want the NSHA to take every opportunity to recruit primary care providers to the province of Nova Scotia, whether they're national, international, or own graduates here in the province of Nova Scotia. We expect them to do the same, and I'll be bringing that up with representatives of the NSHA at the next meeting.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, in 2015, the Auditor General told this government that the computer systems managed for them by Unisys needed improvement in order to meet security standards. The Auditor General found that monthly reports were not being reviewed and that the meetings that were supposed to take place were not occurring. And the Premier has pointed in many directions since the release of this private information of hundreds of people in our province. He's pointed towards police. He's pointed towards the young man into whose possession this information came. But what he has not done is what the people would look to a Premier, in fact, to do. He has not accepted responsibility for this problem. So I wish to ask him squarely, will the Premier accept responsibility for the government's failure to properly look after the personal information of the people of the province?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. You referred to the Auditor General, Mr. Speaker, who laid out a number of conditions in and around all of the IT sector. We continue to make investments in our budgets to continue to improve the security in and around the things the Auditor General brought up, Mr. Speaker. But as the honourable member refers to the most recent breach, of course, Mr. Speaker, I'm as upset about this as every Nova Scotian is. The minister responded in a way to pull down that information as quickly as possible. We turn it over to the authorities. They will do what they believe is appropriate at this time. Our job now is to continue to make sure that we secure the information that is there and make sure that before that site goes up, it is safe.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, what the Premier's response overlooks is that his government was told to improve the Unisys-managed computer systems in order to protect the integrity and confidentiality of this very data. That is to say, the government was previously aware of this problem. The personal information that was released was not information that was hacked. It was taken from a system much like an unlocked filing cabinet sitting out on the sidewalk. Mr. Speaker, there's a standard for the handling of public affairs, and the government's handling of this issue certainly appears to have fallen short. So I want to ask the Premier plainly, does his government's securing of the personal information of the people of the province meet his standards for competence and adequate performance?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to tell him, Mr. Speaker, that the breach took place is not acceptable to our government. It's not acceptable to me. It's why I'm proud of the minister pulling that site down immediately upon finding that. Mr. Speaker, we'll be working with our service provider to find out exactly what happened. In the meantime, we did the appropriate thing, was calling the right authorities, Mr. to deal with the issue, pull down that site, and make sure, Mr. Speaker, that the breach will not happen again.
The honourable member for Kings North.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, a news story on Monday revealed some troubling details about a recent tragedy in Spring Hill, and I'll table the story. A family member told a reporter about Mark Poulin's frustration over his repeated attempts to get help from Veterans Affairs for PSTD. In a heartbreaking note after a failed suicide attempt, Poulin wrote that he was happy he wasn't going to be another soldier that happened to fall through the cracks in support for system for veterans. This is the second tragedy of this sort in the province, and there's already an inquiry underway. Mr. Speaker, my question is, will the minister ask the Chief Medical Examiner to include this Spring Hill tragedy into the public inquiry into the Lionel Desmond situation?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. Our hearts and thoughts go out to the families, Mr. Speaker, who were victims in the Spring Hill circumstances. These are devastating circumstances to our veterans and to their extended family members. We're aware of these circumstances. There has been reference to an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, for these family members to participate in the upcoming inquiry, and we will follow through, Mr. Speaker, to ensure they're aware of that process.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotian veterans have told us they need help. They have told their provincial government that their unique medical needs are not being met by the system, and they proposed a walk-in clinic model that the Premier and other Liberals have said they agree with. Yet funding for the clinic was not contained in this year's budget. So my question for the Minister of Health is, will the Minister get started on a clinic to help our veterans and work out responsibility for the cost with his federal cousins later?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the member noted in his question, of course, we recognize the importance and the opportunity being presented here. Certainly thank the veterans who have brought this proposal forward, met with them and reviewed the details. We recognize that more work needed to be done to flesh out exactly, as the member mentioned, the financial aspects of the proposal. That work is underway within the department, Mr. Speaker, and that will inform the next meeting I have with the Minister of Veterans Affairs on this topic as well. So again, we're still looking forward to moving forward in this regard.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Justice. Cesar Lalo is the most prolific sex offender in our province's history. Dozens of children's lives were ruined by his conduct while he was a government employee. The Supreme Court of Nova Scotia has concluded on 2 occasions that the government is responsible, yet victims of Lalo's abuse continue to be met with lengthy delays and conflict in their efforts to be compensated by the government for the horrible suffering they endured while under its supervision. Cases are now taking more than 2 years to resolve, and some claims have been waiting for more than 6 months for the Department of Justice to simply respond. So what will the Minister of Justice do to ensure that claims made by victims of sexual abuse while under government supervision are dealt with respectfully and in a timely manner?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for the question. The circumstances she referred to are just atrocious and horrendous, Mr. Speaker, in today's society. It's simply unacceptable. I'm not familiar with the specific circumstances of what my colleague is speaking about, but Mr. Speaker, there is a process. There are legal elements attached to these discussions, and I'm confident that the Legal Services Division within the Department of Justice are working as efficiently and effectively as they can with representatives to ensure these matters proceed.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The problem is they're not proceeding quickly enough. And in 2002, in his independent review of the government's response to institutional abuse, Justice Fred Kaufman recommended an approach to abuse claims that is flexible and able to settle obvious claims and able to dispute the issue of damages in a way that is respectful. 16 years later, though, the Department of Justice is taking a very adversarial approach and many lengthy delays for the victims. Despite court decisions to the contrary, the government is denying liability for the actions of sex offenders like Cesar Lalo and moving abuse claims to trial. This is unfortunate and it re-victimizes. So when will the Minister of Justice ensure that institutional abuse victims in Nova Scotia are treated with respect and dignity they deserve when seeking compensation from this government.
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly recognize the trauma and the re-victimization that my colleague speaks to in these circumstances. These are the most horrific types of circumstances, Mr. Speaker, for victims to have to deal with. But I want to assure my colleague that that the Department of Justice, within the process, and working with representatives of those victims, Mr. Speaker, will continue to advance these matters as efficiently, as effectively as they possibly can.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Health. On April 10th, the Ombudsman filed a notice with the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal. The Ombudsman is asking the court to determine whether the Ombudsman can compel the production of unredacted documents from the Department of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Ombudsman is an independent officer of the legislature, not just any old third party. Under the Public Inquiries Act, Nova Scotia's Ombudsman has the same power as the Supreme Court to compel witnesses to produce documents. I'd like to ask the Minister today, why is the Minister's Department forcing the Ombudsman to go to court to see unredacted documents?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, we want to work with the Ombudsman's office. The legislation in place, Mr. Speaker, respecting the protection of personal health information doesn't provide an exemption, Mr. Speaker. If the Ombudsman was in a position to provide the appropriate permissions to access that information, we would certainly forthright in delivering that information to his office. Mr. Speaker, in the current situation, there's consideration of legal matters, and in fact, the courts is exactly the place to have that interpretation clarified.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Oh boy, Mr. Speaker, what lengths this government will go to protect private information when the Ombudsman is trying to get it. Mr. Speaker, the Premier once boasted that he was going to make Nova Scotia the most open and transparent government in history. How could we have possibly known? How could we have possibly known that he was talking about the FOIPOP portal was going to be the most open in history, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, part of the Ombudsman's job is to investigate alleged wrongdoing by the government. I'd like to ask the Minister today, will the Minister commit today to save taxpayers' money by just simply producing the documents the Ombudsman is asking for?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd assure the member opposite that I'll follow due course with respect to the legislation that governs the privacy of Nova Scotians and the Health Care Act, Mr. Speaker, and we'll continue to do that. And Mr. Speaker, if that provision was available, I'd certainly work to provide that information to the Ombudsman. At this point, that's not the advice that I've received, that information can be disclosed based upon that legislation, and the courts, Mr. Speaker, is, of course, the avenue to have clarification and the interpretation of the legislation provided.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. Last week, in the middle of exam time, students at Acadia University received a surprise from the university, and not a welcome one, Mr. Speaker. It wasn't exactly a tweet, which some people like to deliver bad news, but when they opened their inboxes, an email was waiting for them, informing them that their tuition fees will be 6% higher next term. That's double the 3% cap that's supposed to exist on tuition fee increases in this province. So in 2015, this government told students and their parents quite clearly universities would have one opportunity to go above the 3% cap, and that opportunity was 2015. So my question for the minister is this: did the minister tell Acadia University something different than what his government told the public in 2015?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. Mr. Speaker, this was Acadia's one-time market adjustment. They did not do one in 2015. Mr. Speaker, I'd also like to add that in the 6% increase that they did to tuition, 3% of that, half of the increase is going directly back into student services, and this was done in consultation with students. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, this government doesn't seem to be very good at consultation, because the Acadia Students' Union says they are disappointed with the lack of communication and the lack of meaningful dialogue around a potential tuition increase. I will table that, Mr. Speaker. This surprise increase creates uncertainty for both students and parents at Acadia and flies in the face of assurances this government has made at a time when it announced the tuition reset. So I have to ask the minister, what is the point of having a cap on tuition fees and tuition fee increases if this Liberal government is going to let universities circumvent it whenever they see fit?
The Honourable Minister of Labour.
Mr. Speaker, in terms of the consultation with universities, it was the NDP who did not consult with universities when they put a cap on universities. Mr. Speaker, I will also add it was the NDP who did not consult with universities when they cut over $30 million from their budgets, and then they expect them to be able to keep tuition below 3%. Mr. Speaker, it's a very simple calculation. When the NDP cut $30 million, the universities suffer. What we've done with the universities, every year we've increased their funding, Mr. Speaker. As well, what we've done is after they were blindsided by having their tuition frozen, we allowed them a one-time market adjustment, and that's what Acadia is exercising. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, Liz Cole suffered from terminal cancer. She sadly spent her final days in the emergency room of the Straight Richmond Hospital. Liz spent 6 days being shuttled around in the ER, and the situation offered Liz and her family no privacy and robbed her of her dignity. During her final days, Liz's family, who are here in the House today, tried to shield their mom from the commotion caused by the arrival of ambulances in a busy emergency room. It's a heartbreaking situation, Mr. Speaker. The Premier has recognized that it is an unacceptable situation, and I am grateful that he has spoken so frankly about it. Liz's children have written a letter to the Premier and the Minister of Health, and I will table that letter outlining their experiences today. My question, Mr. Speaker, is there are 53 people in Richmond trying to access palliative care. The Straight Richmond Palliative Care Society have identified an immediate need for 6 dedicated palliative care beds. Can the Minister commit to getting the Straight area the beds that they need today?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for raising this question again. Mr. Speaker, as I said last week, it is completely unacceptable that a Nova Scotian looking for end-of-life care, Mr. Speaker, is put in the conditions that the Honourable Member raised in this House. I spoke to her outside of this House about the report that came in. She tabled it actually in this House. I've taken the report to take back, to put in the Department of Health, Mr. Speaker, to find out exactly what is happening around palliative care and the fact that the Straight Richmond, Mr. Speaker, in all communities across this province need a myriad of options when it comes to palliative care, and those Nova Scotians who are at the end of their life and their families require the appropriate level of care, Mr. Speaker. It is tough enough to witness a loved one at the end of their life, Mr. Speaker. It is tough enough for all of us and all Nova Scotians, the family that is in the gallery, to experience that, Mr. Speaker, but it is completely unacceptable that they do that in an environment that is not one that we all want for our own loved ones.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honourable Premier for his response. I met with the Straight Richmond Area Palliative Care Society yesterday, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to table again the proposal that is the answer for what we need in the Straight area and the Straight Richmond Hospital. It even includes a summary document to make it easier. It's all updated. They've worked tirelessly on this all night. We have watched people as they suffer the way Liz Cole and her family suffered because there are no resources, there's no plan. Where there's a plan, Mr. Speaker, that's what we need. Who can blame them for being frustrated? We've been asking since 2014. Will the Minister or the Honourable Premier direct his staff and the staff of the Nova Scotia Health Authority to make it a priority to meet with the Straight Richmond Palliative Care Society, please?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the frustration, Mr. Speaker, that the Honourable Member is bringing to the floor of the House goes back even beyond 2014, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Member would know there's been no dedicated palliative care beds in the Straight Richmond Hospital. Mr. Speaker, there's been palliative care beds that end up being used in acute care. It is unacceptable that has been the case the honourable members brought to this House. It is unacceptable for the family that's in the gallery and families in Richmond County or any part of our province, Mr. Speaker, not to be given the appropriate level of care at end of life. Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for bringing this document to the House. I will ensure, Mr. Speaker, that that document revised in the right hands. I also said the honourable member outside of this House, I would make sure she had the appropriate meetings at the appropriate time when we look at this document to ensure, Mr. Speaker, the level of care that every Nova Scotia family should expect at their time of need will be in place.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. We are now less than 3 months from the end of the school year, and the Minister has yet to provide an update on the overcrowding issue at Basin View Drive in Bedford. Parents are very concerned that the school has capacity for 579 students, but held 680 students this school year. And this, Mr. Speaker, is only one of the schools in the Bedford area that's bursting at the seams. Basin View Drive parents may not find out until June if their grade 5 and 6 students are going to be moved to another school or crammed into a portable. My question is this, Mr. Speaker: why did the Minister neglect this situation to the point where parents still don't know if their children will be attending an overcrowded school in September? Thank you,
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have a lot of school communities in the province that are experiencing population pressures. These have come forward through the regions to the department. These are informing the capital decisions that we are making. We understand that communities have been waiting for this information. We are working as quickly as possible to provide them with a capital plan. The extra time we have taken has been to ensure we are doing our best to comply with the recommendations that have come forward from the Auditor General's office, as well as Dr. Glaze, in relation to better capital planning for the long term. Thank you.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, the Basin View SAC is scrambling to answer questions from parents about this situation, with no clear direction or information from the Minister. The SAC had, quote, grave concerns about the interim overcrowding options proposed in February by the HRSB, including split shifts and portables, and I'm happy to table that, Mr. Speaker. Shortly after the HRSB made recommendations, it was abolished. Now parents don't know where to turn. Families are left wondering where the kids will go next school year. Teachers are wondering where they will teach. And administration wonders how they'll put together accurate class lists. My question is this, Mr. Speaker: with the elected school boards abolished, when will the Minister demonstrate the necessary leadership to get answers for the families of Basin View Drive? Thank you, Mr.
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know this is an issue for that community. The member for Bedford has been a dogged advocate for that community in bringing this issue to my attention more times than I would have liked to, actually. But I thank that member and this member. We know that there's capital pressures across the province. We are working as quickly as we can to ensure that communities not only have a one-year plan that's provided by the province, which has been the long-standing practice, but a multiple-year plan so that communities know what capital investments are happening in their communities over a number of years. Thank you.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Well, Mr. Speaker, here we go again. Another day that an emergency room was closed in Cape Breton. Earlier last week and again yesterday, a doctor shortage caused the closure of the emergency department at the Victoria County Memorial Hospital in Bedeck, something that was previously unheard of, Mr. Speaker, until recently. This is at a time when residents need this ER because others throughout the CBRM might be closed, and residents don't want or can't wait 6 to 8 hours at the Cape Breton Regional Hospital. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, this is a continuing saga of the healthcare crisis in Cape Breton under this government. So my question is, what is the Minister doing to ensure that the Bedeck ER, which is almost 100 kilometres away from the Cape Breton Regional Hospital, remains open at all times?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to advise the member, Mr. Speaker, that I'd actually had the opportunity to visit that site earlier this year. Had an opportunity to sit down with physicians, fantastic physicians and frontline healthcare providers in that facility. They raised these concerns with me at that time, that the needs and the pressures, Mr. Speaker, at that facility, like in others that were coming. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to advise the member member that one of the things that that's been done through the partnership with the Department of Immigration, in fact, the very first physician coming to Nova Scotia through that program actually accepted a position at that very facility, Mr. Speaker. I believe, if I recall correctly, they're expected to start in May. So while it's unfortunate timing, Mr. Speaker, we are seeing progress.
The honourable member for Victoria the Lakes.
Well, that's very good, Mr. Speaker, but to add insult to injury, we're now learning that by the year end, the plan is to close lab services at the hospital in Medeck. Mr. Speaker, taking this important service away from the residents of Southern Victoria County is another example of how this government's raid on the healthcare system in Cape Breton. All at a time when Medeck Hospital successfully recruited to fill a void that resulted from the retirement of Dr. Carlisle Chow. Mr. Speaker, given the fact that many residents are having difficulty finding a doctor in this current climate, the removal or lack of this service, the lab service, wouldn't be much of an incentive for a new doctor to move to the area. So my question to the Minister, is it the intention of the Health Authority and this Minister to make Victoria County Memorial Hospital in Medeck a skeleton when it comes to offering services? Or will the Minister commit today that these and other services will continue at the Victoria County Memorial Hospital well into the future?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to advise the member that indeed, again, when I've toured across the province and visited various hospital sites, not just regional hospitals, but some community hospitals as well, have this very conversation, Mr. Speaker. And one of the things that came up was, in fact, with the advent of technology, that there's indeed new ways to gather and collect and report on blood test results, Mr. Speaker, at a point of care, and so there's certainly opportunities being pursued at some locations to take advantage of this opportunity. And I can assure the member opposite and all members that indeed blood services will continue to be provided to Nova Scotians to continue to provide the care that they need.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. I think many of us in this House have had the experience of having great conversations with constituents on the doorstep at election time, only to learn that those residents are permanent residents and cannot vote. These constituents have a stake in our communities and in our province, and we have the power to give permanent residents the right to vote in municipal elections. That would be a great step in the right direction. Permanent residents are important members of our communities, and they should have the same right to vote for their municipal representatives as any other Nova Scotian. Does the Minister support extending the right to vote in municipal elections to permanent residents?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question and the conversations that we've had during estimates and throughout this session. I've also had this conversation with some elected representatives in communities across the province. This is something that I've taken under advisement. I'm doing my own research on it. We don't have a path forward at this point, but I have offered to the member to keep our conversations going to determine what a path forward is going to be.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, allowing permanent residents to vote at the municipal level would be a wonderful signal that we truly value their voice in our communities. We know Nova Scotia needs to encourage more immigrants to stay for our province to thrive. Now is the time to prioritize this. Halifax Regional Municipality has been asking for this change since 2014. There is no reason to wait. Will the minister commit to working across party lines to make this change before the end of the year?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I have had that conversation as well with HRM in regards to permanent residents voting, but also having that broader discussion about residents being able to run for public office. So there's a lot of work that has to be done in this file. We work with 50 municipal units across the province. We've had the conversation with one municipal unit at this point, which is HRM. And again, I appreciate the comments, Mr. Speaker, that I've had with my colleague and her advocacy for this issue, and we'll continue to have those conversations with her and our municipal partners. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester-Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. With the emergence of spring comes the hope of warm temperatures. And with warm temperatures, many residents of my constituency have not felt in their homes since last autumn. Sometimes seniors on fixed incomes and other people on fixed incomes have to make a choice between food, shelter, or paying their power bill. The parade of people who have fallen behind in their power bills is lengthening at my office. Will the Minister please explain how the Department of Community Services can assist those who have struggled through the winter only to be threatened to be without power this spring?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for the question. As the honourable member knows, we are in the process of transforming the Department of Community Services and the services that we do offer, Mr. Speaker. Among those are a wage incentive, Mr. Speaker, which will allow Nova Scotians who are on income assistance to actually earn more money and keep more money, Mr. Speaker. There are a number of other things that changes that we're making. We changed, for example, the way that we treat income that's gained under maintenance enforcement, Mr. Speaker, or maintenance rather, so that in fact that will no longer be counted as income towards receiving income assistance, Mr. Speaker, and there are a number of other things we're doing as well. Thank you.
The honourable member for Colchester, Musqueam Valley.
The problem is not so much the unwillingness to pay in most cases, but the increasing power bills and increasing cost of living together. People are just lacking in funds to do it all. And I am concerned that the coming cap and trade regulations will only add to the problem. So my question is, will the Minister see that any new public housing projects include heat and lights, as people are no longer able to keep up with the power rate increases in the province?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for his comments, and I will absolutely take that back to Housing Nova Scotia. I think that's a very good practical idea, Mr. Speaker. I would also want to let him know that we're looking at, when we build new builds, that we build them in a way that it makes them much more energy efficient, Mr. Speaker, because we all know that if you don't have to spend it in the first place, that's the best place to save money. Thank you very much.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question to the Minister of Health. As he knows, the community of Pubnico has been worried about the ambulance service for quite some time, and today I tabled a petition in the House with 570 concerned citizens of the area about their service. I know a lot of the problem does revolve around the transfer times and traveling here to Halifax, that many of the ambulances across the province are now being stretched to a point where they're not being effective. Just recently there was an elderly lady, an 80-year-old, who fell in the co-op parking lot and waited 35 minutes for an ambulance to come and attend to her needs. So I'm just wondering if the Minister thinks that 35 minutes is an acceptable wait time.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe, as the member would know, we have certainly service level agreements and expectations with the ambulance provider, Mr. Speaker. We fully expect that they operate across the province, not just in the members' community, but from one end of the province to the other, in adherence with those stated performance expectations. And 35 minutes, Mr. Speaker, would seem to fall outside of the norm of that expectation.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
As the Minister is aware, Pubnico was the last ambulance service to transfer to the EHS system of the day. They did sign a deal with the province at the time to make sure that they stayed as a level 1 ambulance base, but they're seeing the erosion of that service continually. Mr. Speaker, just recently, an elderly senior with shortness of breath had waited over 25 minutes for an ambulance to come. So will the Minister endeavour to review the contract with EMC to ensure that all Nova Scotians get a respectable wait time and a respectable response from the ambulance service?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's in fact what the structure of the contract, and that's why you have service level agreements. That is the expected response times very clearly laid out within those contracts, Mr. Speaker. So we'll continue to do that. As the member knows, there's some reporting on that, and through estimates, the member had asked for some additional details for his part of the province. So we're pulling that report together, and we'll certainly be providing that as previously promised.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, there are 100,000 Nova Scotians that continue to find themselves without a family doctor. I hear far too often from my constituents in Pictou County that they continue to have difficulty finding a primary care physician. Having to go to the emergency room or a walk-in clinic does not provide the continuity of care between a doctor and patient that Nova Scotians deserve and should expect. The question to the Minister, does the Minister believe that Nova Scotians without a primary care physician receive the same level of care from those who are lucky enough to have a family physician?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for raising this very important topic here in the legislature. Of course, the objective of the province and our partners, the health authorities, is to strengthen and improve access to primary care services for Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. That includes access to primary care providers, whether it's a nurse practitioner, family physician. Certainly family physicians are part of that collaborative care team, and that's why we continue to take steps, Mr. Speaker, to improve our ability to recruit and retain physicians and other primary care providers in Nova Scotia. Thank you.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, a recent story shared by one of my constituents highlights how individuals who don't have a primary care physician fall through the cracks, and in some cases to devastating patient outcomes. This constituent's elderly, frail father has to rely on emergency room physicians for treatment when experiencing health issues. That's a situation that is happening all the time for many Nova Scotia families. When physicians offer competing options of treatment to a patient, disastrous mistakes can be made without having a primary care physician there to help the patient choose the best care option. Question to the Minister, will the Minister admit that Nova Scotia has a two-tier healthcare system for those that have a primary care physician and those that don't?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, pleased to advise the member opposite of some of the many things taking place to improve the access to primary care in Nova Scotia. That includes the growing commitment and investments in collaborative care practices, because we know, Mr. Speaker, that new healthcare professionals are coming out and they're being trained in this way. There's an opportunity in these collaborative practices, Mr. Speaker, to better balance a work-life environment, Mr. Speaker, while providing top-notch quality primary care services to patients. That's what we're hearing is the desire to believe it'll help both with recruitment and retention. The information the NSHA received in a recent expression of interest, Mr. Speaker, saw over 100 submissions to pursue this type of practice. That would include existing physicians and healthcare providers here in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, we know we're on the right track. We know that it's going to improve access for all Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This question is for the Minister of Environment. The minister recently approved a quarry in Victoria County, Cape Breton, to triple its size. Glenn Cossack, who has managed mining projects in 30 different countries and has a home in the area, says that when the quarry is operating at full capacity, that will mean 15 to 25-ton trucks rolling along the Cabot Trail every 9 to 14 minutes. He believes that Aspey Bay, St. Margaret Village, Sugarloaf, Meat Cove, Cape North, Dingwall, Neils Harbour, and Ingonish will all be negatively impacted. Beautiful area. And yet, when Municipal Councillor Norm MacDonald tried to arrange a public meeting on this subject, he never even heard back from the department. So my question for the minister, respectfully, does he think his department did enough to adequately inform and consult these communities before he gave approval for that expansion?
The Honourable Minister of the Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We followed the process as we do with all applications for the environmental assessment. There was a 30-day public submission period. We took all the submissions in, and our staff analyzed it, the expert opinion and the science that's brought in the application. The terms and conditions are there to ensure that noise and dust levels are minimal. Obviously, whenever there's activity at a quarry, that's because there's activity in the adjacent area for the roads. Nova Scotians expect good roads, especially in areas where we have high volume of tourism, and this is based on the evidence, and we're happy with the application. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it doesn't sound very good for tourism in the area. So my supplementary is for the Minister responsible for tourism, Nova Scotia. Andrew Stevenson recently sold his financial planning companies to begin developing an adventure tourism mecca right in the area of the quarry. It would include hiking and mountain biking trails, year-round cabins, and potentially a nano brewery. His business plan hinges on the high potential for the area to attract European tourists, which is what we need. But he's worried, Mr. Speaker. He says the government may be scratching their head in 2 or 3 or 4 years from now saying, what did we do? We've got a whole adventure tourism industry that's growing and those trucks are killing it. So my question to the Minister of Tourism is, what part of the environmental assessment process, the industrial approval process, or any other process can give this man confidence that he won't be scratching his head with regret 3 years from now?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. All members of this House realize how important tourism is in this province, and we all know that Cape Breton's leading that charge, Mr. Speaker. Let's be honest, right? Come on.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.